I think this is another one where you need a blanket and some snacks. Yeah. Hey Spuzz, it's Jamie. Welcome back to another video, first video channel. I don't know, but welcome either way. I think my voice broke a little bit in that intro. I'm sorry, my voice sounds very funny today.
Hello.
I've not spoken much yet today. This is kind of like the first thing I'm doing, kind of. I don't know where I was going with that. Today, we are here for probably what's gonna end up being another feature-length reaction video, a commentary, a discussion, breaking down of transphobia or just misinformation about trans people, because we are here to watch a Jubilee video, another one. Oh yes. So this one is called Should Minors Transition, and I believe it's the second one like this that they've done, but it's part of the like undecided series. I think there's people who are like on both sides of this debate. Yes, minors should transition. No, minors shouldn't transition. And then there's some undecided people, and the people who've made up their minds have a little debate, and then the undecided people are like, I've made up my mind, or maybe they haven't, I don't know. I find it an interesting thing that's done. I'm very curious about the angle that's being taken, and I'm interested to watch it and to see the reasoning from the people who are saying no, minors shouldn't transition, and whether it's actually based in facts of how the transition process would work for a child, because often it's not, and that's why people feel like kids shouldn't transition, because they have some misinformation about it. But yes, it's a Monday morning for me right now. It won't be when you watch this, and my breath caught in my throat. And we're just gonna get on and watch this together. Are you ready? The pizza just does not show at all. I need to move that. There's the pizza. Oakley dokley.
Oakley dokley.
Today we're bringing a new version of Middle Ground. We'll be exploring the topic, should minors be allowed to medically transition?
Well, that wasn't in the title. Should minors be allowed to medically transition? Where are we coming at from this? Because like a majority of medical side of transitioning is not even accessible to minors who are like young. I'm guessing they're maybe going at the puberty blocker angle. Do you know, I'm gonna save the facts for later.
We'll be introducing an undecided group, and they'll be listening to a discussion between liberals and conservatives, and the undecided group will pick a side after each prompt. Specifically liberals and conservatives. Like, I don't know if it's the same in the States, but in the UK, something that's been quite like worrying, stressful, I don't know, feeling like there's a lack of safe space is the fact that it's not just like left-wing, right-wing that divides like pro-trans, anti-trans. There's a lot of left-wing people that are transphobic in the UK, and it's like, whoa. Transitioning has become a social media trend.
Absolutely agree. I mean, it is just skyrocketing, the amount of children that you see falling into this, and we need to stop it.
Absolutely not. People said the same thing about people coming out being lesbian, gay, or bisexual as it got more normalized, as people became more accepting of like their children and things like that. They're like, everybody wants to be gay. Now social media is around, people my age, like we see other trans people, and being aware that that's something that's being accepted by other people makes you more comfortable with yourself and like comfortable with like internalizing that it's okay to be trans in public.
I think you're falling prey to the survivorship bias, which is just sort of, you're overlooking all of the cases of people who either weren't able to come out because they weren't comfortable or safe to do so, or they either died due to or other mental health reasons. But over time, if you look at left-handedness, that skyrocketed in a similar rate as people became more accepting.
Yes, thank you.
I reject that, but
I wonder why. I reject that. Why? I want to hear the reasons why he rejects that. These people have read some news article about rapid onset gender dysphoria and gone, ha ha ha, way to legitimize my discomfort with trans people.
If that's the case, if more people are transitioning simply because it's more acceptable, then how can your side also say that there's a trans genocide happening? Those are completely opposite. No, I know you didn't, but liberals say that all the time. They're saying that there's a trans genocide because for some reason. So I'm just curious as to how you would square that circle.
Can we define what the trans genocide, narrative is as raised by her?
I would like her to answer that because she's the one that brought it up.
Yeah, because so we hear people saying simply because legislation is being passed across the country that is banning minors from being able to transition, that automatically means that those children would commit. And that is simply an abusive statement in of itself.
Statistically, a lot of minors who aren't able to transition who would like to.
I've had to beep out the actual word used, but I'm sure you could have a guess. That is based on stats. It's saying if this does not happen, there is a risk of this based on these scientific findings. It's not a threat of like, do this or this will happen. It's a, if you don't do this, if you don't allow this to happen, this is a potential consequence.
Why don't we have this? Why don't we have this? Why don't we have the same rates in the past that if that was the case?
How could we have known that the people who were committing were transgender if they didn't feel safe to come out?
Thank you, Tammy.
When you look at like
members of each generation that identify as LGBTQ or in that community, it's like less than 2%. And then for some reason, as soon as we get to Generation Z, it's 20%.
It's actually been gradually increasing generation by generation, roughly doubling per generation. You need to take into account societal opinions. You need to take into account the fact that we had an AIDS epidemic that killed a lot of the older generation of LGBTQ plus people, including trans people. And then where was my brain going? And awareness. It's so much easier for people to find the language to describe themselves. It's not a social contagion. Social media isn't making people trans. It's giving people the language they need to understand how they are feeling. I found out through a documentary. Imagine if I had been in a generation where there wasn't television or where trans people were not in documentaries. How the hell would I have known? A few people figured it out on their own without anything. A lot of people would have just ended up living knowing there wasn't something right, knowing they wanted to do something about it, but not knowing they could, or not knowing how to, or being too scared because of the opinions of society. So to be like, oh, it's gone from 2% to suddenly 20%, it hasn't. It's been gradually increasing generation on generation because of these various different factors. And also, what's the problem? What is the problem if there's more LGBTQ plus people in the world? There's only a problem if you don't like LGBTQ plus people. So
okay, this is just because it's more open, it's more accepting now, everyone, it's okay to be that. But then in the same beat, you guys will say that if you don't accept them, they're more likely to commit or something. But it kind of sounds like a double-edged sword.
So that didn't sound double-edged to me. It sounded pretty accurate. Like if you're not accepting of somebody, they're more likely to be self-hating. Like
lack of acceptance can lead to poorer mental health. It's literally been found. Just because there is more awareness, but there is also some very loud pushback. So people are able to figure out who they are, and they may, within their close circle, or from some people, or in certain scenarios, have acceptance because you can find that now. But generally, they could be rejected, they could have trouble in school, they could have trouble at work, they could see what's happening on a wider scale, on a political scale with trans people, and that could affect their mental well-being. Like, it's that they're saying, oh, it can't possibly be because of awareness and more acceptance in society, because actually we recognize that as a society we're not accepting. Like, it's, I just don't get it. I don't get it. Their arguments, I mean.
if you're telling somebody that they're not allowed to do something, they shouldn't do something, they're not fitting into their own body, especially experiencing dysphoria in itself, it's a mental battle in general. Like,
So to clarify your point, I think you're saying that acceptance is what's leading to it. Is that right?
it's a mixture between self-acceptance, outer acceptance. It's a conversation between nature and nurture. Like,
See, here's the problem with that. There's two longitudinal studies alone that I could cite. In Sweden, from 1973 to 2003, they looked at a large number of subjects who had before transition and after transition, and they had worse comorbidities, they had worse mental health issues. Sweden is a very tolerant, liberal, progressive country. A study this year, published in Denmark, 2023, 42-year longitudinal study, and what they found is that the mental health issues did not decline, they actually were augmented. It was worse for individuals who thought that by transitioning they would solve their mental health issues. It actually got worse. It doesn't help, it doesn't solve these issues. It shows it's a contagion. That is the key word.
Let's pause there. Then. What are your guys' thoughts?
It shows it's a contagion. So did this study take into account other variables that could be impacting mental health? Was it specifically that transitioning made it worse? Or was it just that people did not get help for their mental health issues, that people did not have acceptance, that people were not able to access medically transitioning and trans healthcare? Why? It won't seem like it to you, but I just took a bit of a pause to read up about the study he was talking about. And this guy has twisted it so much. So this was a study, a 42-year longitudinal study on people in Denmark, and it was to look at if trans people had a higher than cisgender individuals in the population. It wasn't to do with the relationship between transitioning and mental health. It was purely like, do trans people have worse mental health than cis people? Let's have a look at this. Oh, yes, they do. The other thing is, it wasn't actually determined how far into transitioning, the length of like hormones, whether people were on hormones, whether they'd had access to surgeries, how bad their gender dysphoria was. Those things weren't measured. We don't know if it has anything to do with access to transitioning. I mean, has hazarding a guess based on all of the other research that does actually look into the factors that specifically impact trans people's mental well-being, you could hazard a guess that it's something to do with lack of acceptance, societal stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and a lack of access to healthcare / high levels of gender dysphoria. So this guy has gone,
yeah, well, there's actually a study that proves my point that transitioning does not actually help trans people.
no, mate, it was saying that trans people have worse mental health than cis people, so we should therefore be supporting trans people, not pulling the support that they already have. Wow. Okay, let's continue.
So let's say that's a pretty popular figure that's been mentioned when it comes to a social media influencer that has risen to fame because of that.
She's just doing what she's doing. I don't think that she's doing anything wrong.
Okay, he.
Do you think that has...
Her pronouns are she, her.
That's transphobic.
Do you think that has inspired?
I'm sorry, you're having like a conversation about a very specific point, and you literally have somebody on there who is flat out purely transphobic, misgendering a trans woman. Oh, this dude is not being nice.
Trans kids?
I think she's also inspired allies to see the human being behind the pronouns and the makeup and the dress, and to see that there's someone who is going through a story, and that watching her go through that story enabled us to see the humanity behind her.
He is degrading women. You see a great disregard. I mean, look at the product that he was supposed to be promoting. It has fallen into.
Her pronouns are she, her.
And with all
This
due
sounds
respect,
to me
it
like the
isn't
people who are
phobic to
following them
speak
are
the
y'all and
truth.
not the youth.
Okay.
That's not a phobia.
The truth is not a phobia, but you are denying the truth and being very rude. And he was going to be like, with all due respect. Couldn't even say the word respect. Maybe it stopped in his mouth because he doesn't have any of his own.
All right, so undecided group. You guys are kind of like the comment section. Which side did you resonate with most? Liberals or conservatives?
This is so bizarre. I find this really, it's not a game.
So why did you resonate most with the liberal group?
Trends pass. Trends end. So calling it a trend is saying that these people's identities are just going to go away, and I don't think that's fair. Why do you think that it's not transphobic to misgender?
Because the concept of misgendering is false. There are two sexes. There's male and female. Well, it's in the chromosomes. It goes beyond superficial or secondary characteristics. He is a male. He was born a male. He will remain a male. It doesn't matter how many chemicals he puts into his body or how many body parts are cut off. And I'll say this again. Telling the truth is not a mental illness.
Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I think that there is a difference between sex and gender.
Telling the truth is not a mental illness. Was that a bit of a slip? Oh, this guy. It's really difficult to have any kind of constructive, meaningful conversation with somebody with an attitude like this, because whatever you say, he's just sat there arrogantly thinking he is right on everything, and he is not wrong, and he's not saying anything bad, and you are not going to convince him otherwise.
And I know you're going to disagree with me, but transgender is its own thing, and she can be. See, no, don't try to blame that on me. You are using the wrong pronouns for this woman, and you're trying to influence something.
Do you have a specific question that you like to ask the liberal group?
I would just like to hear more from them because I feel like it was very one-sided.
Thank you. So you sat more on the conservative side. Do you want to explain why you decided to come here?
Yeah, so I think, it is just factual that there are more people transitioning or at least coming out, not even just as transgender, but just, within the LGBTQ community as a whole. And so I do see, I think for me, it does become a little bit grayer when you start to say, okay, is that because people are being influenced to transition, or is it because it's more accepting and people are feeling more open and safe about coming out? And I think, when you're in, a friend group or when you, associate with certain people, I think you are likelier to maybe, explore your gender a little bit more or, look more into those avenues. And I think that can influence someone to transition if, maybe beforehand that wouldn't have been a consideration.
I mean, I would like to point out that trans people are the last people who'd want anybody to try to live as a gender they're not, to transition when it's not right for them, anything like that. Trans people are not out here to influence anybody to be trans or to transition. Also, you cannot influence somebody to be trans. It's something you are, it's something you're not. There's nothing wrong with people exploring their gender expression. There is nothing wrong with people exploring who they are and their identity. And I think when people get so caught up in oh my god, firstly, being trans is not a social contagion. You cannot catch it like a cold. We are not a virus. It's so bizarre that this whole thing is just taken off. I made this whole big video on rapid onset gender dysphoria and breaking it down. If you want to go watch that, I'll put a link in the description box. But that's kind of where this whole conversation has stemmed from. And it's just not true. But that has caused all of this harm that's like, it's a social contagion. It's given legitimacy to this transphobic rhetoric of you can catch being trans when you can't. But then at the same time, it's like, why are people so afraid of others exploring who they are? That's what I don't get. Exploring gender expression, exploring identity. Like, what is the problem? People who are not trans and who go to a gender identity clinic and are very truthful and honest about their experiences and have a knowledgeable doctor will not get access to hormones if they are not trans. I'm not saying it never happens. We clearly have people who detransition and they deserve support. But 99% of the time, transitioning is the correct thing for people to do. We've seen this increase in people coming out as trans. We have not seen this increase in regret rates.
Do you have a specific question that you'd like to ask either side?
Yeah, I guess I would like to ask, the liberal side, and I can't necessarily trace it back to a specific time when this happened, but I do think we have seen recently, a rise in people identifying with genders that aren't necessarily within a binary. Would you say that's a rise? How would you, I guess, account for that?
I think, as I said earlier, that is just accounted by survivorship bias. People previously were not comfortable enough with coming out, and that's where that difference comes from. And eventually, that skyrocketing rate will even out.
I definitely do think that is kind of a factor of it, that, people are just coming out more and are feeling more accepted. And I absolutely do believe that, that is a good that social media has done. But I do also kind of push back on the idea that it's just completely that. Like, when you look at figures who, rise to prominence, like, for example, Dylan Mulvaney, these are people with huge platforms that, are reaching to, younger people who are at stages in their lives where, they are exploring ideas of gender and gender expression and identity. And so I guess personally, I would push back a little bit against the idea that it's just people who, had it been more accepting in the past, they would have come out. I do think there is, a rise. I feel like the numbers just don't really account for it necessarily being just that group of people. I think there are people, especially youth, who are identifying more kind of on the gender spectrum or as transgender that maybe wouldn't have before.
What's that based on though? Like, where has he pulled that statistical analysis from? You have no idea. The strongest indication that actual solid research tells us is that it is because people find out, people have the knowledge, people have some level of more societal acceptance to explore who they are. I think I just don't understand why people are so scared of others finding themselves. Is it because they didn't get the opportunity to and they're jealous? I don't know, but why is it such a problem?
So, you're the only undecided. Can you clarify why you still remain undecided?
Yeah, I think the reason I remained undecided was because although I appreciate the presentations of both sides and I see both their points, I was still a little bit unclear as far as what's like each opinion was on each side. So I would just be curious to ask the liberal side, is there any evidence that you guys could present that would suggest that transitioning lowers the rate of
I would say on one hand, there is data that suggests that trans minors who are not able to medically transition when they do want to, their attempt rate is around 40%, and that drops to below 10% when they are able to transition. Moreover, if I wasn't able to transition and I didn't have any support in my life, I would probably
very quiet after they said that. I think what is baffling to me is it seems as though at least two of the people on the liberal side are trans themselves, and I do not know about the conservative side. I would assume that at least one of them is definitely not trans, the one who has spoken the most. So you're taking the points of multiple trans people and then predominantly hearing from one cis person. It confuses me why cis people would ever get listened to more than trans people when it comes to what it's like to be a trans person and the truth about being trans.
Social media contagion, could you present any other arena as far as other instances where we've seen social media have that influence on?
I'd love to add just every aspect of mainstream media. So CNN, all mainstream news sources, when we talk about even major corporations, we have Pride Month, for God's sake, right? We have an entire month where all corporations, all major corporations, even the government, President Joe Biden is putting a pride flag. It seems like every aspect of our top dog, main people in society are promoting it, right? And then if you go down to social media, everyone's promoting it, right? Each Instagram, or maybe not Twitter anymore, or X now, but TikTok, there's trends, there's things that are happening where it is being promoted. And the fact that there's influencers, I think, is just proving the fact that...
But he seems to watch a lot of this type of content and pay a lot of attention to it. Yes, there is a Pride Month. Yes, some corporations, some governments, social media places have a lot of pride things and flags during that time. Yes, with the problem, the other 11 months for the cis straights doesn't influence more people. Well, that might. Lack of acceptance can influence people to not to live as their true selves. I don't really know where he was going with that point. It sounded very conspiracy theory. Ooh.
Oh, CNN having a pride flag is making all of the kids trans.
It is indeed a trend.
Gender dysphoria is a mental illness.
Okay.
It is a break with reality. I'll start at where I've said before. There are two sexes. It's determined not just by external characteristics, but by chromosomes. When somebody dies and is buried, and 400 years later, if they exhume the body and they test those bones, they're going to see that it's an XX or an XY. It's a male or a female.
And is that 100%? Is that all the time? Does that work all the time? No, it doesn't. And stop bringing up bones being dug up. Who gives a shit? You're dead.
It's a mental issue, and you want to treat it that way. You treat it with counseling, with therapy, reflecting reality, helping the person to be comfortable with the sex that they're born with. Sex.
Conversion therapy, which literally doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. It should be banned everywhere. Oh my God. Do you not think that if I could have walked in and had some therapy to have been happy as my assigned sex, I wouldn't have done that, rather than going through years of hormone treatment, the wait lists, the discrimination of being a trans person, multiple surgeries? Really? Like, you think that people just choose to do this? It doesn't work. You cannot treat people out of being trans. Literally just talking about conversion therapy, and we all know it does not work.
What do you guys think about that? It's calling it a mental illness.
Yes, I want to respond to your comment about bones and skeletons. I study bioanthropology, and actually they're moving in a direction where they're using terminology like assumed or estimated gender, because there is large overlap between the general sort of estimations. Also, no one's going to dig up someone's bones unless they've already consented to donating their skeleton somewhere. No one just goes grave robbing for that.
But that's irrelevant.
Let's hear a little bit.
The point is,
it's irrelevant to bring it up then.
That's irrelevant. Like, she shot down your whole point.
That's irrelevant.
The steam coming out of his ears. So basically, the scientists don't give a shit. Your point, nobody cares.
No, it is relevant to point out that sex is determined at birth and it doesn't change.
But what's the point you're making with the skeleton example?
The point that it doesn't change even over long periods of time.
Even in
death.
When you are dead, it cannot change. 400 years, still not enough time to change, no.
I'd like to hear a little bit more from
Thank you for your
both
help
of
with
you.
that.
If you're walking around life constantly being told something like what you're supposed to identify as and you feel other than, like, of course, as time goes on, you're going to feel worse and worse about that specific thing.
I don't think there's a reason to transition if you don't have a mental illness. Like, there's something wrong in
That's
your
like
brain.
saying you shouldn't cut your hair because you don't want long hair.
Wow, that is so not a comparison.
So when
Stay on topic.
I mean when it's the opposite concept of gender or body dysmorphia. So when you look in the mirror and you see what's wrong with, like, you have an uncomfortability with your secondary sex characteristics, and so the treatment is to change that to match with what you want it to be. But I mean, he's right. You can't change your sex. But it's in the brain. You treat the body to help the brain. It's not any different. And honestly, I'm somebody who I don't think we should stigmatize mental illness. That's the whole point is, I have anxiety, PTSD from when I was in the military and everything else. I don't think we should be stigmatizing mental illnesses. And so I think that calling it for what it is just accepting that, and it actually helps with treatment and to what you're treating, because you're treating the brain. You have to go to a therapist, you have to go all of that. So I think it's no issue to call it.
And when you treat the brain, you don't cut the body, though. I mean, if somebody has or you treat the reason why they perceive themselves incorrectly.
No, he did not just make that comparison. So he scoffs at the trans guy trying to help them understand a point, but then he makes that comparison. Wow.
If somebody has dysmorphia, you don't say, well, just cut off a body part.
But you're talking about two different conditions. Just because dysphoria and dysmorphia sound somewhat similar and are related to people's feelings about their body does not mean that they require the same treatment or that they are the same thing. Gender dysphoria is not actually classified as a mental illness. So having this conversation, you're arguing against the medical classification of something. I don't get that. There is a recognized way of diagnosing and treating gender dysphoria, and the conservatives, or at least this conservative, is no.
I do not agree. I know more about trans people and about gender dysphoria than all of the medical professionals and all of the trans people.
The medical boards are wrong. Arthur, conservative, am right. That's just his surname now, conservative.
But this is a complete violation of the Hippocratic Oath.
Gender dysphoria is a mental health condition, and the treatment for this condition is to do a medical transition if that person chooses to have those procedures done. It won't go away with just a simple pill. It's gender dysphoria. It has nothing to do with sex and bones and your DNA.
Do you think children are capable of making that decision?
Let me pose a question.
They're not making a decision.
Homosexuality actually used to be considered as a mental illness. Do you think there's any correlation here with what's going on currently with the trans movement?
It has to do with the way you present yourself. And again, I call it sex dysphoria because it's dysphoria of your sex, but it has to do with your secondary sex characteristics that you're presenting to society. You know, in a lot of regards, and even Deborah So wrote this in End of Gender, she actually advocated for this because the same hormone imbalance in the womb that causes more, femininity and homosexuality seems to be very similarly tied to gender dysphoria as well. It's just it's a further step along the way. It's a further condition. And I agree where I use mental illness and mental health condition synonymously, essentially.
So I think what's interesting about this topic is that, we need to consider both statistics as well as personal anecdotes. If you guys don't mind, do you want to share a little bit about your personal experiences with this particular topic?
Yeah, so I didn't even know that trans people existed until I was around 19, I think. That information never came to me. I'm 25 right now. I didn't really realize I was trans until I was 22. And I started medically transitioning when I was 23. I've experienced depression for most of my life, probably since I was 13 or so, and a lot of ideation throughout high school and early in college. But pretty much around the time I had, felt comfortable with my where I'd gone in transitioning, that had largely decreased pretty much entirely. And
this is what's interesting because I know when we talk about a lot of this stuff, every transsexual that I know that we started feeling dysphoria around the very time that we became self-aware, around the age of 4 years old. But yeah, I knew around the age of 4 that there was something different. I wanted to be the opposite sex. I knew I wasn't the opposite sex, but it was something that I wished, I could. I knew that there was something different.
It's very interesting that they have a trans conservative person on. This happens, and Jubilee did a whole video about this. It was trans liberals versus trans conservatives. But there is a large disparity between the opinions of the cis man and the trans woman on the conservative side. They are not coming at this from the same opinion, I do not think. So I'm interested to see how it's going to unfold when they actually address the specific question of should minors transition? Because I'm assuming that's maybe what they based the two sides on, that one question, because there's not been agreement so far among the conservatives, and the middle person is being very, very quiet.
I tried to dress on at 4 years old and went from there, and then transitioned later in life when I finally accepted it myself.
I'd be curious to hear your perspective as someone, I think you mentioned that you have kids that have transitioned.
Yes, I have that magical uterus. My third child came out at 11 and told us that he was a boy. He was assigned female at birth. And so he socially transitioned, obviously, because he was only 11. He is now an 18-year-old college university student and thriving. And then my youngest child came out as a trans girl at the age of 15. So I live this with my children. I made the trek to the emergency room with attempt and a plan with each of my children.
Did at any point did your opinion on this is a gender dysphoria or a mental illness change as you've had actual kids that has transitioned?
My opinion hasn't changed. It's a mental health condition, but antidepressants weren't working. Before Mitchell came out, we tried everything. We'd been to every single therapist, and nothing was touching it until we used he, him pronouns. And that was all it took to make things better for him initially. And then we did the medical transition.
I don't even know where to start here.
I don't even know where to start here. Yeah, because what is there to say? You've literally just had a mother tell you a very truthful and personal journey of having trans kids and supporting them and the difference it made in their lives for the better. And you're going to sit there and say what? That they shouldn't have had any of that access? That she should have just let them carry on as they were?
Sex is not assigned at birth, it's established at conception. We have to get to biology here. And the second thing is, we're seeing this move. You were mentioning the academic setting. Notice how the academic terms are changing, but this is a result of pressure. This is a result of societal pressure. That's what happened with homosexuality, by the way. Homosexuality was recognized as unhealthy behavior behaviors. Now, whether you call it a mental illness or a deviant behavior or destructive behavior, that's a point of debate. It's an unhealthy behavior for sure.
Oh, wow, they've really got somebody who's very, very conservative and wow. How did they think they were going to have a sensible conversation with somebody like this in the group? That's so fascinating. He will just spew out whatever he wants, no matter how much truth is behind it. Like that study that was completely twisted just to get people to listen to him and accept his point of view. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And certainly it's the case with transgenderism, somebody cutting off healthy body parts. We have seen numerous detransitioners now coming forward. They had severe health and mental problems like the ones that you've talked about.
Numerous detransitioners. Shall we put that into a percentage? It's very, very small. It's like 1 to under 1%. It's, oh dear, transgenderism. I think that tells everything.
Now let's actually hear from the undecided group. So undecided group.
I still find this so bizarre that there's like this chat going on and then there's these people who like walk to either side and it's like now changing between the questions and it's a very interesting concept. Could I see this happen? Like, would they sit down and, I'm just trying to think if they'd sit down and do a similar-esque thing for people who are gay.
I do think it's a mental health condition. I don't like calling it an illness. Everyone has things they don't like about their bodies. I don't think we're calling everyone mentally ill. It's interesting how you brought up conception and saying that gender is decided at conception because...
Sex is determined. That's what I said, not gender. I said sex.
Sex, sorry. Sex is decided at conception because...
Established,
okay. It's someone very close to me is trans, and so hearing it from people who identify as trans themselves, you can talk about statistics and facts all day, but if you actually listen to people and what they're going through and their experience, I feel like it's just much deeper.
You were on the undecided in the previous prompt, but now it seems like you went on the conservative side. What changed and what argument spoke to you most?
To my knowledge, the American Psychological Association still categorizes gender dysphoria as a mental illness. So just to stay on the side of facts, and at this time what the experts are categorizing as, I'm going to obviously side with that side.
So literally just because of that, does the American Psychological, because I know like in the UK, the NHS is literally like gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. There's something here that says the American Psychiatric Association has revised its diagnostic and statistical DSM no longer lists transgender as a mental disorder. I'm trying to find out if she's purely gone on that side for like to be factually correct. I want to know if it is factually correct in terms of how the APA, I can't find a straight answer. Under like the NHS guidance, which is the UK like National Health Service, it says gender dysphoria is not a mental illness.
I feel like science is always changing its definitions,
right?
Oh,
absolutely.
We used to drill heads inside to fix migraines. I'm curious if that will change your mind if that classification was taken away.
Well, to my knowledge, I think the American Psychological Association does intend to later categorize it under neurodivergence rather than mental illness, but it's also something that needs to be treated. When people with gender dysphoria go into get the diagnosis, they do have to go to a psychologist and get a prescription and this sort of stuff, so it's part of the process. So I understand that science is constantly an evolving field of study, but as to what we know now, I think I'd rather just stay safe and stay with what the facts say.
I'm confused by this. And it's like the psychologist can't do a prescription, that would be a psychiatrist. And I think it's the American Psychiatric Association. I feel like it's because she doesn't know enough. And it's like, all you need to do is listen to the people who are living this experience. You don't need to fully understand it. It's actually been categorized in the way it's been categorized for so long, so people can gain access to healthcare. Yeah.
Do you feel like if they are to medically transition, that they need to go through a series or rounds of different psychiatric tests?
Well, in the case of children, I think that would be necessary just because this is, I know in some cases it can be reversible, but this is a life-changing decision.
So you brought up the word life-changing, right? Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there's any question that you'd like to ask either side, because that seems to be the big stipulation in this kind of debate here.
Well, I guess I would like to ask the liberals, did you see in your own lives vast improvements? What did that look like, the vast improvements that you saw?
My mental health was just largely improved. I was having a much easier time, making friends because I was more confident in my own identity.
My children's lives changed completely. It was like turning on a light switch. They brightened, they were more social, they excelled in school again after failing. They just completely transformed their lives.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
You were on the conservative side, and now you're back on the undecided. You guys flip-flopped here. What's something that kind of brought you back into the middle here?
Yeah, I would say, I guess my main reason for being here is that I just am unclear as to like, I guess the difference between something being a mental illness or mental condition. I know some people in the conversation said that they use them interchangeably. Some people said that they prefer to use the term mental condition rather than illness. I guess what kind of differentiates those things, if anything?
I think you just hit the nail on the head there. Changing the name of something doesn't change the fundamental reality that there's a problem, there's a mental health issue that the person has. It's a disorder, it's a break from reality. That's just a fact. The person is born male or female and thinks that they should be something else.
Just does not understand it, has not listened to an inch of what has been said in this conversation. Zero compassion. Even if you don't accept it, what should be accepted is just being a respectful human being. Using somebody's name, somebody's pronouns, because I'm sure you wouldn't like it if somebody came up and used the wrong name and pronouns. Using those things out of basic respect. And then just letting people get on with their lives. It's not any concern to this guy whether people transition, whether people are trans or not. Why not just leave them to it? You don't like it, don't do it. Nobody's telling you to transition.
Now, regardless of how that one treats that, the fact is, and I would submit, even from the comments from the liberal side, they recognize that it's an illness that needs to be treated.
I recognize that it needs treating.
They recognize that it's an illness that needs to be treated, but not with conversion therapy. An illness to be treated. Aren't all illnesses something to be recognized and treated? Isn't everything? Like, it just because of a word doesn't mean that, it must be treated by talking people out of it. Like, that's what he's just fixated on this. Okay, well, this must mean this. Listen to the actual trans people or the people who have trans loved ones.
But it's not a break from reality. That's a psychosis.
A psychosis is a break from reality.
Exactly.
Let her talk. Arthur, let him talk.
A psychosis is a break from reality.
Which is a mental illness.
Gender dysphoria is not a psychosis.
But not every condition is the same. Not every condition would require the same treatment. That's like saying anything that fits under this broad category is this thing and this thing only. That doesn't work.
But it is a break from reality because the person thinks they should be something else.
I always think there's a point in educating and trying, but after a certain point and after people have said certain things over and over again, that does make me just go, there is no point. There is no point conversing with this man. I feel really bad for the liberals in this situation having to hear what he is saying, particularly the trans people having to hear what he is saying, because that is not a way to treat other human beings and be respectful to others the way he's talking about trans people.
Clear, it's a disconnect between reality. You're born male, you're born female, but then your brain is saying something else.
Is he really annoying anybody else? Like, the smugness is just infuriating, and also for him embarrassing, because he's being so smug and so righteous and so arrogant about an opinion that is just objectively, factually, morally wrong.
The cool thing about this entire debate is that liberals for once agree that there's possibly a soul, right? They say, I was born male or female, but something deep down, something in me is I'm actually this. Reality is what is physical. And so if you are physically or biologically male or female, you don't need to change your body, you need to change what you're thinking.
Okay, let's go back to the undecided.
Yeah.
So this other guy has the same opinion as a very outspoken one, but just hasn't been talking as much. And says some very interesting things. So he went on like a rant about pride flags and Pride Month, and now something about the soul. Okay.
Did that help clarify, or is there any additional questions that bring up?
I guess it kind of did. When I think of like a mental illness, it is something that like we treat. And so I guess in that regard, I don't know if it's necessarily a position. I feel like we do talk about, people who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, like you treat that with some, I think in many cases, I don't know if it's all the time, I'm sure it's not all the time, but in the majority of the cases, you treat that with some kind of transition, whether it's a medical or a social or both. And so
you do. You can shake your head all you like because you individually disagree with it, but the medical boards don't. They disagree with you. You do treat it like he sat there like, no. But you do. It's literally how you treat gender dysphoria, is with transitioning.
I see kind of that definition. I feel like, my takeaway is that I feel like they both kind of agree with that, and I don't know necessarily that I think it's a politically charged definition. I think it's like obviously how you interpret it and like what is treatment, what is proper treatment, what is included within a mental illness, what isn't. But I guess my takeaway I think is like, I think we, or at least the people in the conversation, I think they agree a lot more on kind of the general topic itself than maybe they might realize. But of course, when you get to nitty gritty, I think that's where you get the division.
The medical community is pushing gender transitions for financial gain.
So I disagree.
Oh, is this why we're going to realize he's a massive conspiracy theorist? We'll get to that in a second. I feel like he's sat there, and even if people are not saying something that necessarily backs him up, he's like, yeah, I'm going to take this as a win for myself. What I don't understand is if people actually cared about having a factually correct opinion on trans people, on transitioning, they would read the papers, they would read what the medical boards say, what the professionals say, what the trans people say, and the conclusion is, oh yes, gender dysphoria is reduced by having access to transitioning, social and medical. Not everybody does the same steps, but doing the steps that are right for the individual reduces their personal gender dysphoria. Great, this is something that is found very consistently, and therefore medical professionals recognize that the gender affirmative approach, i.e. having access to gender affirming care, that was a bad definition, being able to socially transition, being able to live as yourself, having access to hormones and surgery related to being trans, that is the correct way to treat gender dysphoria. And doing all of this and treating gender dysphoria with a gender affirmative approach increases people's well-being, has a positive impact on people's lives, okay? And it's just very infuriating to hear people who are so stuck and they're just like, no, sex, male, female, nothing else. I don't care about anything else. If you think you're a trans, there is something deeply wrong with you in your head. You need to talk to somebody and be convinced out of it. They don't hear anything else. They don't hear anything else beyond their own voice. And there is no point for at least one person on the conservative side in them having this conversation, because he's just not going to listen to any of it.
When I started going through my process of transitioning, I didn't feel pushed by any medical...
As a reminder, we are now onto the question of the medical community is pushing gender transitions for financial gain. I mean, what financial gain? Like...
Professional at all. There were, in fact, quite the opposite. A lot of hurdles and just like bureaucratic red tape sections I had to like work through. But it's not something that I think, in my experience, was pushed onto me at least.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. When I started my transition, it took over a year just for me to get to my third doctor's appointment for us to actually like talk and evaluate things. And as far as cost goes, my insurance covered everything.
But they are still getting paid. Just the government or somebody else is paying them.
I mean, in comparison to a BBL, yeah.
Well, yeah. So here, but they're still getting paid and they're still getting financial. I actually think there's 3 different types of doctors. I think that there are people that are going out there and doing it for financial gain. We saw it in Vanderbilt. We saw it in so many other instances where they are doing it. We also see that they are manipulating the system. That's why we have a lot of detransitioners right now, and that's why we're seeing that.
Where are the statistics that we have a lot right now?
That community grow is because they're manipulating.
The community of detransitioners hasn't grown. They're just being given a much larger platform. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be speaking up on their own experiences. I'm not saying that nobody ever experiences a bad doctor. There are bad doctors, regardless of what they are trying to treat, what kind of speciality they're in. There are bad people, there are bad actors. I'm not saying that no one's ever experienced a bad doctor trying to treat them for gender dysphoria. I'm not saying that nobody ever detransitions. People detransition. But I think having this like overarching view of, yes, being trans is being pushed and people are being made trans specifically for financial gain. That's a very, very interesting take.
Manipulating patients, they're manipulating parents. And so the third is, I don't know if it's ineptitude or if it's incompetence or laziness, but I think that there is a section, there's a group of mental health providers who simply right now, we want to cure everything with a pill. And so we see this not only in the trans community, but we see this in the SSRI community. We see this, everybody's being put onto something, and we're not really treating the root causes. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing a high comorbidity of like autism in the community. A lot of people that have autism are getting sucked into this, and they're not being treated for the autism, they're treating for gender dysphoria.
They're making it sound like you can give people a pill and make autism go away. Treat people for, like, why would people with autism have a lower ability of knowing who they are than people who don't have autism? I do not understand when this is brought up, because it's also like very limited findings, purely correlational. No.
So one thing to consider, and I did research on this, is that apparently based on top or bottom surgeries, it can actually range from around $10,000 to $25,000 from male to female transitions to female to male transitions. And I think what both sides can probably agree on is that America is a for-profit healthcare industry, right? We don't have universal healthcare.
Yeah, and
anything to consider there.
So with the
socialism.
Well, I mean, I think something to consider is we're seeing a similar pattern in terms of like an increase in the number of people coming out as trans and accessing gender clinics in the UK, where there is a healthcare system and there is not profit to be made by doctors and individual like healthcare providers because it's a national system. This topic, this argument, this whole thing as a question doesn't work when put into the UK perspective. Yet we're seeing a similar pattern among the trans community in the UK. It's not something that's being done for profit. And also, just because there may be some bad doctors and bad actors out there who are treating gender dysphoria, it doesn't mean that trans people should be penalised for that. It means that the medical community should be more rigorously checked and know better how to treat gender dysphoria in trans people. And then the final point is just the sheer minuteness of the number of trans people who can actually access these surgeries. Trans people who get lower surgery, I do not know very many, and I know less who are in the States than who are in the UK who have been able to access lower surgery. It's not something that is handed out, pushed upon people, made super easy to access. It's just not a huge amount of people get lower surgery. And if that's where the money is being made.
With the Vanderbilt situation, she actually said because of Obamacare, they have to pay for it. And so they're forcing insurance companies to pay for it. So it became a big moneymaker, was her specific phrase that she said.
I just want to remind everyone that there are international standards of care, and there are many countries out there that have social medicine, and it's not all for profit.
Argentina and Denmark apparently are one of the two countries that has included, I believe, transitioning for minors in their private and public healthcare plans.
I'd like to comment, but I want to give you a chance first.
No, it's kind of hard to draw intentions completely with these kinds of things. I completely agree with you that America is a for-profit country, and so regardless of what trend or what surgery is getting popular, they're going to find a way to make money out of it.
Yeah, America is a for-profit and everything, but an EpiPen costs a whole lot more than testosterone does. So even with that, and we're once again, the push for being trans in medical societies, as far as our experience goes, doesn't really exist because two people here are saying that, you know, it was quite the opposite. It took significantly longer for anything to happen, significantly longer to try to do anything, significantly longer than, you know, as far as like cosmetic surgeries or anything like that goes. So.
And that is the most common story of people who are transitioning across multiple different countries, that it is a lengthy and difficult process with a lot of hurdles where there is not literally somebody beckoning you through a door to come and pay for hormones and surgery and get them that day. It's hard. If it was all for financial gain, you'd think it would be a little bit easier to access.
I need to point out, Big Pharma makes big money off of butchering little boys and girls. There is big money to be made in this.
Every time this guy talks, oh my God.
Follow the money. Ted Hidalgo, he's a father who's been fighting very hard because he's in a fraught divorce. His son was being put through the transitions. He saw in his medical bills $200.
He doesn't even know like the right way to describe it. I know it sounds like a really small thing, but like transgenderism put through the transitions. He knows so little, he doesn't even understand the correct phrasing to use, the correct way to talk about it, even just in simple words. It's so jarring. He's clearly like, you can tell the kind of websites that he has been on and reading, and I'm like, why are you so concerned about it? Like, what has led to this? Because he knows about a study, I mean, that he described in a way that would benefit his point. He knows about certain individual people. He knows about certain articles and things. Like, why?
$1,000 for the chemical treatments alone. We could talk about the Jeff Younger situation. Jeff is trying to fight to save his son. Now his ex-wife has taken the son here to transition him to try to become a girl. Not only are the medical costs being put upon him, but also legal costs.
So to your point though, so what we saw out of the whistleblower out of St. Louis, who...
Transphobic parents have a trans child, the other parent is not transphobic and is accepting their child's journey and what they need to do, and the transphobic parent is kicking up a fuss about it. He's just coming at it from his like one-track transphobic mind.
Is a self-identified queer woman who's married to a trans man, and she blew the whistle on what's going on there. Now, where I hear a lot of adults in this situation say that it was a long process for you. That's not what we're hearing from detransitioners and a lot of these patients, and that's not what the St. Louis whistleblower said. She said they were basically pencil whipping psychologist letters so that they could start Myers on transition. And that's one of the reasons why I think that clinic is also closing.
I mean, once again, for me, I'm always going to go on personal experience before I go on stats, because there are too many trans people specifically who don't get accounted into those statistics. So it's hard for me to be like, yes, this number and yes, this number. You know, whatever. But for me, it's like, it took 1.5 years of therapy for me and my therapist, who was also trans, to go through that process and write that out for me to be comfortable, or me to be, you know, whatever it may be, to get what I needed. So, and on top of that, the money situation, there's so many trans people who can't afford to transition, whether they're on insurance or not. So for me,
other people are paying for it.
What other
the government,
people?
Medicare, Medicaid. My goodness,
Right,
this was a discussion in Wyoming.
Let's stop it here, and we'll ask the
Yes, they
undecided
are.
group. Okay, undecided group, let's hear about which side that you resonate with more, liberals or conservatives.
Ooh.
You started off in the undecided,
Interesting.
then conservative, and now the liberal.
Yeah.
You've been all across the
Yeah,
spectrum.
all over the place.
Let's hear about what kind of resonated with you more to switch sides this time.
I'm sure and confident that there are practitioners out there who are pushing people to transition, who are just signing off on prescriptions, because yes, I mean, you know, like the points were made, that there is money to be made, of course, but I don't know that I'd go as far as to say, you know, that there is this, like, I think someone mentioned it on the liberal side, that there's like a conspiracy going on. I don't think that's the case. I think, again, there are absolutely predatory, you know, practitioners and maybe even large organizations who are looking to profit off of, you know, the medical transitioning process. But, you know, I think...
I'm not denying that there's probably bad practitioners out there and individuals, but again, that should not be up to any community of people needing medical treatment to be penalized for. But really, if you want to pick a group of people to profit off of medically, trans people are not the ones. I don't know why that would be a go-to to try and make money off of a certain community in a medical setting. The population is very small, regardless of an increase in numbers of the population in recent years because of more people realizing that they are trans and they can live as themselves. It's still a tiny, tiny portion of the population. It's not common to be trans, and not a huge amount of people actually go on to access healthcare. And it's just baffling that people would think that there's some big conspiracy going on, or that like people are making huge amounts of money just from trans people.
Someone mentioned, you know, the aspect of personal experiences and how for many trans people it's extremely expensive. And even if you are on some kind of insurance, or even if you are on some kind of plan, it can still, you know, the cost can, you know, mount up a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I guess in any movement, right, there are going to be people that take advantage about it for their own selfish gains.
How much money is, I guess, there to be made in the transition process?
That's a hard question to answer, right? Because you're creating a medical patient for life. So it's over the course of a person's lifetime that they would be buying hormones and all this.
It's not accurate.
You've created a medical patient for life. Interesting phrasing.
You have to take
Not every
hormones.
trans person
They
stays
have
on
to
the
take-
phone.
Let's let her speak. Let's let her speak.
No,
Let's
I
let her
don't
speak.
support
Let's let her speak.
Yeah.
Let's let her speak.
So you're right. I mean, there are a lot of people that may come off. It's more so on the trans man side than the trans woman side, where you have to be on hormones forever, otherwise it comes back. And if you have your primary sex organs removed as well. So that's kind of a hard question to answer what it is over the course of a lifetime. I think they've estimated up to 100,000 to 200,000. But like one surgery, so like a vaginoplasty cost about $20,000 to $30,000. I think the phalloplasty costs more, and then you go down a little bit with top surgeries and stuff like that. But it's still thousands of dollars. You know, at least, I mean, a breast augmentation is about $10,000.
I've had children have surgeries and medication for various illnesses, and I always find the way to pay for it. And I found the way to pay for what needed in this case.
How much did it cost?
I'm not comfortable sharing that.
Okay.
I can say that for me, I pay about like $10 every like 4 months for my medication.
So you've been kind of consistent throughout in each of these prompts of staying on the liberal side.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you might want to ask that may potentially maybe even sway you to the other side, or just something maybe that you're not considering?
My cousin is trans, and he is so important to me, and so saying that it's a mental illness, saying that it's pushing when you can see that so many trans people of color are being denied treatment, I don't think that that's fair to say that it's pushing. I feel like I would be disrespecting someone very close to me if I was over there and saying that it's a mental illness and then they're pushing transitioning just so they can make money.
Okay, so you're back on the undecided. What made you stay here?
It's a bit dangerous to generalize or demonize the medical community and state that there's like a wide contingent or conspiracy trying to push transitioning, especially if we don't have evidence of it. I think there's probably, like he was saying, evidence of predatory practitioners and that sort of thing. If it brings them some sort of financial benefit, we do have to question whether their motives are entirely pure, but that could be true of like any disease. So it's kind of both sides, I think, had good points and both were kind of right. So I'm not in the middle because I can't make a decision. I'm more in the middle because I agree with them both.
Schools should include trans conversation in sex ed.
Why not? Of course they should. Trans people exist. Like, the LGBTQ plus people exist and should be discussed in these concepts. Like, I grew up just being like, everybody is straight. And the term cis wasn't even used. It was just assumed.
An age-appropriate time, I agree, yes.
What is that age appropriate?
I think by grades 3 or 4, they understand.
So what is that, like around 8, 9, or?
I don't know anymore. My kids are too old. But that sounds about right. I think 8 or 9 years old is a good time because gender is a concept that is formed in the mind of a child around the ages of 2, 3, or 4 years old. By the time they're 7 or 8, they understand the permanency of gender. So I think that's a good time to introduce it.
Now, should they be talked about as just as much as, let's say, heterosexual sex, or more in terms of including different historical relevancy, anything like that?
I think it would be great to introduce the difference between gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation, because that is 3 completely different realms, and children can understand the difference between gender expression and gender identity at that age without ever having to talk about sex.
Yeah, I definitely disagree. I think especially
She's
what
just
they're
talking
proposing
facts.
right now, a lot of the mainstream sort of education on sex ed is pretty like vulgar. You're looking at a couple like books. You see a lot of parents going out to like city committee meetings and they're reading books in front of like the school committee, and the school has to like stop the entire thing because they're reading such vulgar stuff.
If I had to push back on that,
Yeah.
though, kind of we've been going through like different personal experiences, and some of these cases we might just be hearing about because they're the most extremist of cases.
Sure.
Do you think that's what's going on, or do you think it's more of a common, prevalent instance that's happening around the country?
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's a differentiation between personal experiences and just what's going on in general. And so, of course, you're going to see like the more popular cases on social media and stuff. But what it really boils down to, the question isn't really so much what's the content, but is it true? And it's not true. And so why should kids be learning about it?
I mean, personally, I think that sex education should be simple biology, and then anything above that should be an opt-in system to where parents have to opt their children into that learning. I really don't think it's the responsibility of teachers to be talking to children about that.
I think that just gives bigoted parents an opportunity to close their kids off from learning about different types of people, though it increases the chances of their child having the same bigoted opinions as the parents. I think if you think it's age appropriate for a child to learn about heterosexual relationships, things like where babies come from, human anatomy, what people's bodies look like. Like I watched videos when I was in year 4, which I would have been like 8, about like sex ed and just like a straight couple and how they had a baby and like all of this stuff. And if that is age appropriate, then why would it be automatically inappropriate for them to learn that sometimes families have 2 dads or 2 mums, or sometimes people transition and your gender identity can be different to your assigned sex, and you can express your gender in whichever way you want to, regardless of your gender identity or your assigned sex. It's not that complicated. I came out as trans to my sisters-in-law when they were 7, and they, 1, didn't care, 2, were not confused, 3, were more intrigued by the fact that I hadn't always had a beard, and then talked about socks. Like, honestly, kids are just like, cool. And they are now coming up to 13 and super chill with it. They understand things, like seeing this younger generation and how they respond. I mean, not as like a whole, there's not going to be a consistent opinion, but generally just seeing how things are spoken about in schools and how much more open things are for gender non-conforming kids, for trans kids, for just LGBT plus kids in general is really nice to see. And I think part of that is to do with the fact that it's brought into curriculum in some places. The guy in the middle was just like,
This shouldn't be taught because it's not a real thing.
oh God, I don't even know what to say to that. Like, I'm sat here as a trans person, you're telling me I'm not real. Okay.
I think it really boils down to it is a parental rights issue, and parents make the ultimate decision how their children learn that.
I disagree only because, like...
But why? Because it's not like a parental decision to, like, say, I don't want my child to learn algebra.
Where I'm from North Carolina, and there was a point where sex ed wasn't being taught, and then there was a point where it was. And when they started teaching sex ed, there were children that were coming forward about, like, being touched inappropriate and things like that because they didn't know that those things were inappropriate private parts because they hadn't been taught otherwise. So not teaching children about their bodies, about their sex, about their gender, about their expression, you're limiting them, you're giving people, pedophiles specifically, the opportunity to prey on them because they don't know any better. You're leaving them in the dark. As far as like gender is concerned, like being trans, had I learned about what trans was at an early age, I think I would have had a much happier life in general.
Yeah.
By 21, I was going into transitioning and everything like that, but I felt and knew that there was something specifically different by the age of like 6, 7, without even knowing what trans was. And had I been taught that, transitioning later on in life would have been completely different.
Yeah, and like I said, I think it was the very first prompt we had. I think almost every transsexual I know had that early experience, right? That's happy in their transition. So I agree in that. I really think it is the it's parents' responsibility.
The schools are supposed to pick up where the parents fall off. That's the whole point of sending your children to school.
No, your parents have the right to make the decision for you.
I think if parents want that much control over what their child is learning in school, then like typically the parents will homeschool their children. I think we can't start going like,
I don't want my child to learn that there are gay people.
Like what justification is there for that other than homophobia?
I don't want my child to learn that trans people exist.
I just want to interject right there, and that is a very U.S. way of thinking, is that parental rights trump everything else. Because there's a Convention of Children's Rights worldwide, and the U.S. is the only country who hasn't signed on to it. So children in other countries have rights before their parents do. And I think that it should be taught in schools to protect the child, not just so that the parent gets to make all the rules.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the undecided group. Which side do you guys resonate with more, liberals or conservatives? I think we have all undecided here. Let's start with you.
That's
because this is interesting because you've always been on the liberal side until now. What spoke to you that made you undecided in this instance?
Well, I would just like to mention that I actually work in childcare and I work with children. And so as much as I think that we should have comprehensive sex education, I think that 5 years old is a bit young.
Why are you going in for like 5 years old? You just picked an age and gone, that's too young. It would clearly be introduced at an age-appropriate time alongside other elements of sex education and that kind of curriculum. We're not saying, okay, at the earliest age, kids are going to be taught what being trans means. It's going to come along with the other stuff. And plus, like, I don't think 5 is too young to know that trans people exist. There's an age-appropriate way of explaining and like most concepts. It's just about how you do it.
I think maybe middle school age, like 10 to high school. I don't think that parents should have completely all the say, because if that parent is more on one side or the other, then they are going to push their child to do what they want them to do, and that child should be able to make that decision for themselves once they are at that age.
Maybe both sides actually do accept, the fact that trans individuals exist. However, more of the discrepancy is around the age and when it's being introduced. What do you think?
I think she mentioned around 8 or 9. I think that's a good age. I have a little brother who's 11, and when he was around that age, he was able to understand that I was queer and that my cousin was trans, and he was able to understand that we were different.
I would say around 8 or 9 is probably fine in my opinion, because that's generally the age in which children have a solid grasp on their own identity. And it's usually, about 10 years after that, maybe, that they, on average, will disclose that. But at that age is when kids will usually...
I'm not really seeing how she's undecided, though, because she was basically just like 5-year-olds shouldn't learn about it. But like, sex ed isn't on the curriculum for 5-year-olds. Like I said, it's introduced alongside the rest of the curriculum at an age-appropriate time. I don't really know why she's undecided, because everything she's saying is kind of just like, yes, it should be included at the correct age. And it's like, yeah, like heterosexual cisgender sex ed should be included, but at the right age.
Figure out that they're not cis, if that's the case.
This lady, she started out with this concept of permanency. I just thought that was so profound. Undergirding the point that I've been making from the outset, that sex, if you want to call it gender...
Undergirding. Undergirding. Wow. What a fascinating word.
There's a permanency about it that needs to be respected. And when you're teaching little kids about transgenderism, you're automatically injecting confusion. That feeds to the very contagion that we were talking about at the outset. It breeds this confusion into children. That's a real problem. I agree with the point that was made here. I don't think that sex should really be pushed onto kids at all. I mean, for hundreds of years, public education didn't teach sex ed, and things went pretty well. You didn't have all this confusion.
How did things go pretty well? This guy's just like, oh no, I don't just disagree with kids being taught about being trans. I disagree with sex ed, full stop. Don't teach kids sex education at all. I mean, they've found someone with some like quite extreme views.
And regarding the situation about or otherwise, you don't need to teach children about transgenderism for them to know that somebody shouldn't be touching your private parts.
Did that help clarify your point?
You know, it did. I think, you know, my takeaway, I guess, you know, I would say I still kind of am unsure where I would stand specifically, like in terms of age ranges and, you know, content. But I think, you know, for me, I think there is kind of, for me, at the center of it is that conflict between, you know, parents that don't want specific things to be talked about and then parents who just don't care at all. But at least knowing that the conversation's going on and maybe signing off on that. I know we've seen that in the past with, you know, like taking the slips home and being, you know, showing the parent if they, you know, like, we're going to take the kids into classes today, we're going to talk about this, you know, sign off if you want them to or not.
However, wouldn't that kind of introduce a bit of a slippery slope? What if that happens when it comes to discussions around history, around race? Do you think that could lead to parents kind of essentially shaping the worldview that may not be factually accurate?
You know, when you start talking about, I guess, you know, teaching about like sex ed and let's say gender expression, sexual orientation, I think you do walk a different line between like, you know, bringing up points of history or, you know, even like the sciences. I mean, everything, you know, what you include in a curriculum, whether it's science, factual, even mathematics, like there's some kind of, you know, political basis there, whether it's super political or super apolitical. I mean, there's always going to be interest there. And so I think what's really important is, you know, curriculum transparency with parents. I think parents and students should be involved in the development of that process so that everyone at least has a say or at least can see what's being talked about at the table.
You really have bounced around everywhere. So I'm curious if you wanted to ask like any specific things.
Part of my issue, I think, with the idea of like having it mandatory at certain ages is that some kids, and this is why I do think parents should have the right to pull their kids out, because I think some parents are, like the really involved parents do know what their kids are ready for and what they aren't. Some kids are not quite ready for those conversations. I think one thing that I heard that was a little concerning to me on the liberal side and kind of kept me here was I did hear someone, I think, say something about parents of other cultures not being willing to, and I've lived in 5 countries. I've lived in 2 Muslim majority countries. I've lived in a Hindu, technically should be secular, but Hindu majority country, and I've lived in a Catholic country. And I think the Western mindset and how we approach issues, and we have to understand, like, when you're coming out of the country and you're bringing your children into a new culture as an immigrant, you want to keep your values at home, right? And there's things that you're going to be concerned about and nervous about, partially because of like religious affiliation.
Sorry, my face was a loud sound, not what was being said.
Just not experiencing it. And so if schools want those conversations to happen, the focus needs to not be going directly to the children, but it needs to be going to the parents. It needs to be prioritizing assimilating the parents into the culture so they are aware how to have the conversations with their kids at home. Because what ultimately happens is if the child is learning something at school and they feel like they can't go home to their parents, and the parents find out about it in a way that's not, you know, congruent or whatever, this creates a distrust from those parents with the school system. And, you know, I mean, that just brings chaos to America. That's a very serious issue.
Chaos to America. I'm confused by her point. So she thinks that parents should also be involved. I mean, fine. Pull the parents in for a conversation about sex ed and LGBTQ plus people as well as the kids. Do it all together. Parents can be aware of what their child is being taught, and it can still be misconstrued by the child. It can still be explained incorrectly. I mean, like algebra could be told wrong from a child to a parent, and kids will not tell their parents everything that is being taught. And I think we need to recognize that there will potentially be, like, you know, across an entire country, quite a lot of LGBTQ plus kids who will see themselves for the first time and recognize that it's okay to be themselves in this school setting under this curriculum. They're not going to go home and speak to their parents if their parents don't share those views or they don't feel like their parents do, and that's okay. Because if children realize something about themselves that is going to cause issues for them at home, they don't need to bring it up. They deserve to have a safe space, and they deserve to not be discriminated against by their parents and kicked out and all of this stuff. I feel like a lot of the points made by the undecided group were, well, yes, trans people should be included in conversations in sex ed in school, but at an age-appropriate time, and then with maybe the caveat that the parents should be involved in what's going on. But I agree with the host about like the slippery slope thing. Where would that stop then? Okay, we allow parents to pull their kids out of trans-related topics. Okay, we allow them to pull their kids out of LGBT plus generally related topics. Okay, what topics do we then stop that for and say, actually, no, parents, you can't have a say on this?
Do you think this is a uniquely American problem?
I think it's a Western viewpoint problem.
Minors are capable of making life-altering decisions.
Yeah, absolutely disagree. There's no way. Minors aren't able to make decisions whether to join the military, get married, or make tattoos. And so when you're talking about something that's super important, like sex, gender, whatever you want to call it, there's no reason we should be chopping up kids, putting a bunch of hormones in them that are super dangerous that we don't quite know the effects of, and then completely changing their life.
What age does he think this stuff is happening? Because like children, I'm sure are like defined as kind of pre-teen, and none of this is happening. Talking from a UK perspective, hormones, the youngest you could access hormones is 16, and the youngest you could have any surgery is 18. In terms of puberty blockers, that would be from an age that puberty would generally onset. Normally that's said at around 12 years old, like 12 to 14 would seem appropriate for puberty blockers. I've not really heard of them coming in younger than 11 or 12, and they're very difficult to access. When these statements are said, I want to know what age, like what person he is imagining in his head is receiving this treatment. Are you seeing a 17-year-old and going inappropriate? Because actually 17-year-olds can do quite a lot independently, and technically minors because they're not 18 yet. But is he sat there imagining a 17-year-old, or is he sat there imagining a 7-year-old? Because there's a big difference between that, and one could access some forms of treatment and some could not access any forms. Medical treatment I'm talking about.
That's what I'm like really passionate about, especially just I think this is like the voice, just this is the sentiment among like a lot of Americans is you can do what you want, but why mess with the kids? And so that's where kind of I'm at. It's like, why mess with the kids?
But like, isn't circumcision really, really common in America? Why? Why does that happen? That's an infant. That is a baby, and you're performing a surgery on a baby. But that's appropriate. That's okay. We're okay with that because it's not trans. But as soon as it's trans related, no. Then kids suddenly can't do anything. They don't know themselves at all. It's inappropriate. Leave the kids alone. I mean, under 18s can get plastic surgery. Under 18s can get medical treatment for other things that is life-altering. Are we saying that should not happen?
For the purpose of this discussion, we're defining minors as under 18.
When you say that we don't know the effects of these chemicals and these drugs and all that, it's worth mentioning that generally speaking, all of these medicines that are used were first introduced to be used to treat cis people for various things. Joe Rogan, for example, takes TRT, very similar drug to what trans men take. Estradiol is used to treat menopause sometimes. There are people who take spironolactone, which is taken by trans femmes. People take that same drug to treat blood pressure.
Yeah, but when we're talking about minors.
And also, puberty blockers have been used for decades to treat precocious puberty, so like early onset puberty in cis kids. And nobody has ever had an issue, ever. And just like any medical treatment, there can be side effects. And if there are side effects, the treatment is the dose is changed or the treatment is stopped if they are bad. Just like with anything. The way that some people describe trans people and like trans healthcare, I would love to just know exactly what they are imagining, because it absolutely does not sound like they are imagining what's actually happening.
It's an issue because I don't think that they have the cognitive ability to consent to long-term decisions, especially when we start to see, like we can talk about studies, like studies show that 90% wind up desisting by the age of 20.
I don't know where 90% came from. 80% is the kind of like the number that's advertised. 80% desistant rate. Actually, it's not. Those studies are flawed. They're very old. They literally count, just as like a small example, I'm going to make a big deep dive video into this topic because it is a hot mess. It's like the ROGD before ROGD happened. It had that kind of same damage and it's still having lasting impacts, like negatively on the trans community and offering fuel to transphobes when it's just incorrect. I'm not saying that Sarah specifically is a transphobe, but it is a rhetoric used a lot by transphobes, this desistance rate. But just as one small example, among that 80%, a large chunk of them were just people who were not contactable at follow-up. The researchers had no idea if these people identified as trans or not, and just because they couldn't contact them, they put them in the desistance group. There was also issues with the diagnostic criteria, which has become more stringent and changed over time since those studies were done. And a lot of the people who were considered trans back then would not meet the criteria now, and actually didn't even meet the criteria back then, but were kind of lumped as like, oh yeah, these people are trans, or these people, it was gender identity identity disorder back then. They were put in that category, but they were not going to persist because they were never trans, but they were counted as desisters. When we look at studies that have more stringent methodologies and use the current criteria for gender dysphoria diagnosis, we actually find tiny desistance rates, like 1 to 2.5% is what's been found. So all of this desistent stuff is just rubbish. Kids do actually know, and the biggest thing is minors are capable of making life-altering decisions. We trust cis kids just to go through puberty, and I'm not advocating for this. It's just if you want one rule for one group of people, why not do it for everybody? If this is what transphobes are saying, or people who think that kids do not know themselves at all, if you do not think that trans kids are able to be aware of their gender and that they are trans, why do you think that cis kids are able to be aware of their gender and that they are cis? Both sets of kids are going to go through a life-altering permanent thing when they hit puberty, and we trust that cis kids know themselves enough and we don't even question it. They just go on and have puberty, and that impacts their life forever. Trans kids were like, no, you got to try this life-altering puberty first that you're telling us you know is wrong, but you're not old enough to know it's wrong. You need to do that first and then come back to us later if it was wrong, and we'll kind of try and fix it for you maybe when you're 26, because now apparently people can't know until they're over 25. But yeah, if we trust cis kids, we should trust trans kids. If we don't trust trans kids, why do we trust cis kids? Put all kids on puberty blockers until they're 26. I'm not saying we should do that at all. That's what it's sounding like, because puberty is life-altering, and if I had access to puberty blockers, that would have been positively life-altering for me. I would have had to have had less surgeries, putting myself at less risk, and I would have been able to be myself and be happier from a much younger age.
We know what puberty blockers, for example, what they do for precocious puberty, but they've never been studied and they're not FDA approved. They're prescribed off-label for people in key growth years and adolescence. And so we're starting to see, even Marcy Bowers talked about starting somebody on puberty blockers and then going straight to cross-sex hormones, and every time they're never able to fully, achieve orgasm as an adult. Every single person that she's ever had, and she's the president of WPATH. You have to do the studies, you have to figure out, and you have to put a pause button on it. Otherwise, what we're doing is literally experimenting on children.
So one thing that's also important to consider too is that currently there are laws, right, when it comes to voting, drinking alcohol, even buying cigarettes at this point, right? I think that is something to consider in terms of this debate.
We don't hold someone's hand when we go in to vote. We go in and vote on our own. When a child who is 16 makes a medical decision to transition, it is made with a team. There's parents, there's psychologists, there's endocrinologists. It's not just one child walking in all by themselves to do it by themselves. We trust children to prepare our food for us at fast food restaurants. We trust children to drive combines on farmland in all 50 states. Why can't we trust a child to tell us that they are not comfortable and that we need to treat them medically with a medical transition?
Because those are practices, those are jobs that aren't going to affect their lives forever.
I also just wanted to address what was said about the WPATH president and puberty blockers. I just had a quick read about it, and there was like a particular case study referred to about one trans person who had vaginoplasty surgery and had been on puberty blockers, and discussions about when puberty blockers should be introduced. But the WPATH standard that Marcy Bowers endorses is that healthcare professionals begin pubertal hormone suppression after trans children first exhibit physical changes of puberty. And she has said that her views of puberty blockers have never wavered. They are safe and reversible. Medicine to delay a puberty can be a helpful tool to give adolescents, their families, and their healthcare providers time to understand a transgender young person's specific needs and develop a plan for healthcare. Puberty blockers are in general positive, an important part of care for gender diverse adolescents. Medical science is constantly evolving, so WPATH regularly reviews and updates standards of care to ensure they reflect the latest science and medical research. So I definitely feel like some of the stuff being said on the conservative side is very much inflated or taken out of context, because I couldn't see specifically what Sarah had said. What I've been able to find is that like sometimes there are concerns that there can be complications if things are started at a certain age later on down the line, but it's a case by case. But as a treatment method, puberty blockers are very much supported by the WPATH, including their president.
That aren't going to affect their lives forever. So that's not even, that comparison just isn't going to work at all.
That's the first thing.
Getting back to...
But those are comparisons that are made on the other side. Wasn't it him that said earlier that you can't like drink alcohol, join the military, and do all of this stuff?
Minors are capable of making life-altering decisions.
Yeah, absolutely disagree. There's no way. Minors aren't able to make decisions whether to join the military, get married, or make tattoos.
And now he's saying, oh, but your examples don't make sense. But like the examples are used by the other side of like, this is what, you can't get a tattoo. She was making a point that minors are able to do these things that we see as like quite grown-up things to do without supervision. But transitioning, like medical related things, that's all done with supervision, medical and parental.
Getting back to this main question, children cannot commit to these life-altering decisions. They don't even know what life they can have. There are so many options that are available to them, and they get cut short. You're making statements about how they have all these adults guiding them into this. That's the whole point. They're guiding them into getting their bodies mutilated when they should be dealing with the mental health issues.
Oh, it's just such a horrible, like, the terminology he uses and the words he used are just really inappropriate and like deliberately inflammatory to people on the fence or who don't agree with people being trans, like mutilation. I go back to the circumcision point. Has he brought that up? No. Does he really care about children? And like children in the medical setting and making these life-altering decisions? I'm not convinced he does. I think this is more to do specifically with trans people rather than actually caring about this as a minors are capable of making life-altering decisions. If you separate that into a trans minors capable and are minors capable, I think there would be different results in the answer from certain people.
Wallace Wong is an unscrupulous medical professional in British Columbia, and he is part of the whole profit regime. They are rushing kids into these procedures. I know this because a father found out that his daughter was being transitioned without knowledge or permission. And when he was telling the public about it, he went to jail. That's what Canada does. So it's not just about big pharma making big money. It's about taking advantage of children.
He did some reading and was like, let me find as many little tidbits of information that can support what I'm saying, and I will make them sound as extreme as possible. Was there another parent involved in this? I'm sure there was. What was the custody situation with those parents? What did the father actually do and say specifically? Like, there's a lot of questions coming from that, and he's just like glossed over it all. And I'm sorry, based on the study he spoke about earlier and how misconstrued that was, little faith.
Have serious problems. I'm making a personal story here. I hope you're listening. Okay? This is horrendous stuff. These children are confused, they have mental health issues, and they shouldn't be stigmatized. I want to be very clear about that.
You're sharing the personal story of a parent who didn't accept their trans child, not the personal story of a trans person. That's a bit different.
But the answer isn't to put them under the knife or put chemicals into them that will alter them permanently.
I don't necessarily believe that anybody's pushing anybody to be trans. Like when you're like, leave the kids alone, it's like, look at how you talk about trans people. Who would want to be trans in that sense? Like who would want to be pushing somebody into that lifestyle to be treated?
It is happening.
Hey, let's
I'm sorry.
let him talk.
I'm passionate about it. I'm sorry.
Why? Why are you passionate about it? Are you passionate about protecting minors in general from certain things? Because like none of that has come out. There's been no other examples of where this passion lies of must protect kids. It's just all to do with trans things. I feel like somebody has fallen down a transphobic rabbit hole and been spoon-fed this like rhetoric to believe all of these lies about the trans community. And he's getting really mad when people say stuff that disagrees with him or when people make a very valid point against his interesting points.
Just because you might not have been able to make that at that age doesn't mean everybody that's 16 or 17 can't make that choice at that age. There's so many 16 and 17-year-olds who have been emancipated, who have been, not emancipated, but when they take care of themselves legally and like their own legal guardian, at that age, they're making that specific decision that I'm old enough and mature enough to make this decision for myself and my life. Like, just because you couldn't do it doesn't mean somebody else can't.
Yeah, to disagree, it's just the laws disagree with that, right? So we have laws against marriage, joining the military, alcohol, drugs, all these sorts of different things.
But that has nothing to do with them as people.
But
marriage. I mean, there are some places that with parental consent, you can get married under 18. And it was only very recently not allowed in the UK that you couldn't do that.
Overall, yeah, there are laws against these things, and so we're talking about a group of people who believe in Santa, right? You're seeing...
What? Is he trying to say being trans is like believing in Santa? Oh my God.
You're seeing younger and younger people get transitions, right? You're talking about people with this tenuous grip on reality. There's no reason we should be pushing sex. When I was 13, 14, I was thinking about my friends, video games, sports.
Good for you. No, seriously, good for you that is all you had to think about. Because that's where cis people very much get confused around where trans people are coming from. Because you have never had to. Why would you? You have never had to think about that. You are not a trans person, and you're also not listening to trans people, so you're never going to understand it. Not that I'd expect anyone who is not trans to understand it fully, but you're never gonna get it.
I, a cis man, thought about sports and my friends.
Not everybody is cis. Not everybody thinks about the same things. Not everybody has the same life experiences.
Let's go to the undecided. Which side do you guys resonate with most?
Oh, interesting. Oh.
So I actually want to pick up right where we left off. How old are you?
17.
Have you gone through different phases throughout your life?
When I was 3 and 4, I really wanted to be famous. I wanted to be a movie star. I wanted to be a singer. When I was...
Oh, this dude. Oh, look, when she was 3, she wanted to be a singer. See, that means that being trans isn't valid.
6 to 7, I wanted to rule the world, actually, quite literally. I thought I'd do a great job. I thought I knew everything. One thing I really wanted to do, and I was really into this idea, was building islands and taking all my friends and family there, and like we could have our own little community type of thing. And then when I was...
Why is he so excited about this? What does he think that this is proving? When you were 6 or 7... did you know that you were a boy? Were you like, I am a boy? I bet you yes, unless there's something else going on that he's not talking about. But has that stayed consistent since you were a child? If people called you a boy when you were a child, were you like, yes, I agree with that? Or just not even thinking about it, just like, cool. Has that stayed consistent for you? Sorry, my point on that is like people want to say,
oh, well, if my child put on a dinosaur costume, should I go and buy them a goat to eat for dinner and call them T-Rex?
It's like, no, that is not what we're saying. And the reason why you are conflating being trans with these kind of like fantasy games and ideas and things that children have is because you are disrespecting the fact that being trans is a valid thing that people can be, and you are seeing being trans also as a fantasy when it's not.
12, I think 13 maybe, basically up to 15, I was really into the idea of becoming an endocrinologist because of the awesome endocrinologist I had. And then when I was 16, so this would have been last year.
These things are all related to like jobs and stuff that she wanted to do in her life, not identity though.
Kind of realized after failing chemistry that maybe medicine was not for me. So I took a government class that I loved, and I've always had a love of politics and that sort of stuff. So now I'm kind of focused on getting into international relations and politics.
Well, I mean, at least you're doing the famous part well right now. So you went through different, 4 to 5 different stages, but you're kind of like on the liberal side at the moment. Can you explain why you decided to step on this stage?
There's certain age groups that...
I don't understand the correlation. 4 to 5 different phases of career choices and future jobs. When I was a young child, I was like, oh, it'd be really cool to work in the corner shop. And then I was like, I really want to be a footballer. And then I've gone through multiple different phases. Yes, I wanted to be a footballer. I was very obsessed. As a child, I played a lot. I played for my local team. Yeah. I've gone through stages of what I want to do. I think everybody has. Didn't stop me from being trans. Changing my mind about what I wanted to do as a career has nothing to do with my gender identity. I think that's a very bizarre comparison. Shaba shared with me recently as well that like, I think people on average change their job like 20 times. And that's as adults. I mean, full-grown at 30, 40, 50-year-olds change their mind about what they want to do for a job. Are they not allowed to transition either?
Probably should not be making life-altering decisions like 3 to 4-year-olds. Absolutely not. But it does ultimately, I do think.
But 3 to 4-year-olds, there is nothing life-altering. There is no decision to make at that age. It's all about the expression that makes them most comfortable and how people refer to them. Nothing permanent, nothing life-altering. Life-altering would come in like late teens at the earliest, 16, 17. Certainly in the UK, 16 at the youngest. As I said, then 18 for surgery. I think in the States, in some places, certain things are accessible a little bit younger, but it's very uncommon. But never for like with a 3-year-old. I mean, what transition-related life-altering decisions is a 3-year-old making? I mean, the answer is none. I'd be very curious to know what some people think.
Parents do need to be involved with that, just because parents do oftentimes have their children's best interests at heart, even if at times to the public or to the child it seems unfair. So I agree, but maybe just a little less with the conservative side this time.
People also have said that you don't even develop your prefrontal cortex until you're 25. You know, I'm 26 and I feel like I can probably resonate with that.
I think the conservative side kept bringing up how there's certain things that you can't do, like in certain age groups. I think they're talking about like joining the military, drinking, but in Europe you can drink at 16. In the US, you can drive at 16, but in other countries, Middle Eastern and European, you can't drive till 18. So how do we determine, like, in actuality, what the limits are?
Do you guys have any thoughts amongst you two of what made you guys go to the conservative side? I'd love to hear a discussion between you two.
The one thing that really resonated with me is we're talking, I think he said, we're talking about people who still believe in make-believes. I just don't think they understand the gravity of the situation. Maybe not just transitioning, but there's certain decisions that they don't understand the gravity of.
I would push back a little. I think, like, especially when it comes to teenagers, I would say like 15, 16, I would say high school range. I think like we should probably give them a little bit more credit. I think, you know, when it comes to something like that, I mean, I would say like, I think it's, of course, you know what I mean, we're talking about minor, it's a huge range, but I think we should in general give a little bit more credit where it's due to them. I will say the reason I'm here is because I think I just agree fundamentally with the idea like making life-altering choices. I don't think, you know, anyone under the age of 18, I guess maybe might be arbitrary, but you know, in that minor range as we've defined it in this country, I would agree. I don't think, you know, life-altering, whether that's a medical transition or even something like, you know, like what school you go to, like what college. I mean, you know, minors make decisions like that all the time, but they're not most of the time, and I would hope, usually they're not, you know, completely on their own. You know, we have support systems, and I think what's really important is that we extend those support systems to like counseling and, you know, people at schools and, you know.
I'm so confused by his point. Is he trying to say that he disagrees with anybody under the age of 18 making any decision that's major about their life at all? Because that's kind of where it was going. And then it was like, but like with college and stuff, they have support. We talked about the process that you have to go through to access medical treatment as a trans person. There are other medical things that under 18s can do that would potentially fall into the same category of like not life-saving, like not emergency surgery kind of vibe, but still incredibly meaningful, important, and have a positive impact on their life that under 18s have that are life-altering. Why is there a different rule for trans people?
Educating parents so that students aren't going into decisions completely on their own.
Minors should be allowed to medically transition.
Absolutely not.
Of course, that's what he said. That's a very loaded question though. Like, I think we need to discuss more about what is actually happening and what is like allowed to happen and like minimum ages for things. And also when we're talking about minors, one group could be going absolutely not because they are thinking of 7-year-olds going on testosterone, and the other group is like, no, yes, because they recognize the actual ages that different things happen for trans people in a medical transition. I mean, I have a vibe that Arthur is like absolutely not, regardless of whether they're like, you know, 17 years and 11 months old. But I would be interested to just hear some like age descriptions and have the medical process like spelled out to everybody in the room.
That has not changed for me. We're talking about mental health issues, and there are a whole host of problems that children deal with when they're struggling with identity or gender dysphoria. Let's treat those issues. Let's treat those causes. I have mentioned numerous cases of former trans kids who were pushed into.
They like a medical professional who goes about things correctly will. The comorbidity of like mental health issues and gender dysphoria, mental health issues are addressed when you go to a gender clinic, and they are like treatment is provided, discussions are had, there is therapy. It's also recognizing that gender dysphoria can play a big role in things like depression and anxiety.
Parents who tried to protect their kids and were punished for doing so. This is a very fraught affair. These are irreversible, damaging procedures, and we have so many detransitioners that are coming out warning the next generation not to do this.
I think it's worth mentioning that the detransitioners, while I do sympathize with them, and I think it's unfortunate that the medical system has failed them, they're a statistical anomaly in the grand scheme of how many people have transitioned medically and surgically.
We don't know that though. So the issue is we don't know what the detransition rate really is, simply because they're falling off the rules. If you don't have your primary sex organs removed, then you can literally stop taking hormones and nobody's following up on them. Also, we also know that the longest study out is the 5-year study, and the average detransition takes place 4 to 10 years after. And so those people are not being counted in those studies. I think that we should be working on mental health coverage.
I mean, I found one thing that says the average duration of transition was 4.7 years among a group of specifically just detransitioners. And there is a study that is quite longitudinal, so it lasted between 1991 and 2017. This was a literature review of all the peer-reviewed articles between 91 and 17. Gender transition is effective in treating gender dysphoria and can significantly improve the well-being of transgender individuals. Positive impact of gender transition on well-being has grown considerably in recent years as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Regrets following gender transition are extremely rare and have become rarer as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Pooling data from numerous studies demonstrates a regret rate ranging from 0.3% to 3.8%. Regrets are most likely a result from a lack of social support after transition or poor surgical outcomes using older techniques. So we're looking at 0.3 to 3.8%, but with a lot of that coming from a lack of social support. As we know, the most common reason for detransitioning is a lack of social support. Many people later go on to retransition when they're in a better situation. We are very, very far off the average overall regret rate for surgeries, which is 14.4%. Even if the transition-related regret rates are underreported at being under 1% to under 4%. And if we take out everybody who is trans but regrets transitioning because of the social stigma and later went on to retransition and only detransition temporarily, that's typically when we see the 0.5% to 1.5% range of regret. That's incredibly far off 14.4%, and we're not having any calls for stopping other surgeries. There's nobody saying we shouldn't do plastic surgery. That's life-altering, that's life-changing. Some of these surgical procedures will have been done on minors. I don't know why the regret rate among trans people or transition-related medical care seems to be expected to be 0, and anything above 0 is not good enough. When actually, if you look at the literature among regret rates, like within medical treatments, transition-related regret rate is so much lower than like anything else, but it's still not good enough. Imagine if it was 14%. There's so much focus being put on the 0.3 to 3.8%, but it's not actually 3.8. It's typically in and around the 1% mark that actually regret because they are not trans. There is so much more care and time given by these conservatives to that 1% than to the 99%. When both deserve care, we shouldn't be ignoring either, but we should recognize that they're distinct groups of people where one group, the 1%, has done something that's not right for them, but that should not stop the 99% from having access to that. Obviously, we don't want anybody to regret anything ever, right? That would be the perfect situation, but that's not the situation we're in. 1% is vastly better than the regret percentage of other medical treatments. I don't understand the emphasis.
We should be getting them to an age of adulthood. We shouldn't be mutilating them as at a young age. And I think that they, like he said, like your prefrontal cortex is where you make impulse decision making. And so that's what develops last. And so we should be getting them there. I think we can look at social transition.
As in like not let people transition until they're over 25. And also, didn't they just find that because 25 was the age that they stopped looking at people? It's not actually specifically 25 where your brain stops developing. I swear I read that and it was like, oh yeah, it's just because they didn't have anybody over the age of 25.
Social transition might not be a zero-sum game because we see that it kind of generally leads to transition, but let them socially transition, get them to adulthood, and see where we're at.
I agree. Let them socially transition, use hormone blockers, start cross hormones at an appropriate age when the body is ready to be receiving cross hormones later on. I also agree that we shouldn't be mutilating children. I don't believe anyone's being mutilated.
Again, like if we're talking about surgeries that are done on children who are definitely not consenting, where is the energy for not having circumcisions anymore? Also, guaranteed if you look into it, the regret rate among trans people who regret having gone through their first puberty will be significantly higher than the regret rate of people who transitioned and then regretted transitioning. Pretty much every single trans person I know transitioned after. Actually, I don't know a single trans person who went on puberty blockers. And I know a lot of trans people. I know some trans people who went on puberty blockers, but not in the sense of like to stop their first puberty from happening. It's alongside hormone treatment. I don't know anybody who started transitioning in childhood and like received medical treatment. I know some people who came out really young but were never able to access anything more than socially transitioning. And every single trans person that I've spoken to about this topic has said they wish they could have not gone through that original puberty. It's a lot more than 1% of the trans community that wish that they could have blocked that first puberty and gone straight to the one that is correct for their gender identity.
Surgery doesn't have to happen before 18 if they are already being treated with cross hormones or hormone blockers, and we can wait until they're 18 if we are helping them and affirming their gender. I don't believe anybody has an agenda of chopping children up.
Yeah, I would just say ultimately those who are promoting this and those who are accepting it will be accountable. We're seeing a lot of different lawsuits coming out. There's a transgender or detransitioner who is now suing Kaiser Permanente up in like San Jose area.
And there was a detransitioner in the UK trying to sue the NHS. Yeah. I think right now, people who are deeply transphobic and trying to prevent trans people from transitioning and like not being discriminated against should be held accountable for the shit they're causing.
Because she felt like he, I don't even know what gender they are, but they felt like they were.
So how much do you really know about the case?
Led into this. They were tricked. They were kind of ran into that system, and now they're suing. And you're going to see a lot of rise of these lawsuits. And so, just to finish, I would say that children are too young to transition. They can't fully grasp this concept, and then also it's just not true. And so we shouldn't be pushing it for kids. And I think the solution to this is...
It's just not true.
Accepting who you actually are, accepting your actual body, going through therapy, and
I did accept who I actually am. Thank you. Nobody else can tell me who I actually am. I know. You don't know. You cannot sit there and say that being trans isn't real when you got two trans people sat opposite you, a mother of trans kids, multiple trans people watching this. How can you sit and that is where there is a skewed perception on what's actually happening in the world. Because trans people are real, okay? We are not Santa. We exist, and denying our existence is denying reality.
I'm a Christian, seeking the gospel, we're made in God's image and likeness, and so allowing God to speak into that through prayer and sacraments. And
personally don't believe in God. I respect other people's belief though. I don't want to be disrespectful, so I'm not going to get into my personal feelings of believing in religion and then not believing like people literally sitting in front of you. If there is actually a God that creates people, then that God created trans people. It wasn't a mistake. It's such a picking and choosing and ignoring elements when it doesn't fit their narrative. Just say you're transphobic. Don't sit back on I care about protecting kids. My religion tells me that trans people aren't real. I care about women's rights. That hasn't come in here, but it's a very common one. Just sit there and say you're transphobic, because the same energy isn't being had for any other kids and kids that are actually facing discrimination and problems, and the same energy isn't had for things that religion actually it's written down and says you can't do or shouldn't do, but people do it and then turn around and say, oh, but because of religion I'm transphobic. I don't think trans people are real because I'm religious. And then when it comes to women's rights, it's oh, trans people are impacting women's rights negatively, and then just silence when women's rights are actually under threat. It's all just transphobia. There is no legitimate reason, and the more people like this try and legitimize their transphobia, the more and more ridiculous it's sounding. Unfortunately though, some people are still believing it. But if you know a bit about trans people, it sounds silly.
I get the argument of, you're not developed until you're 25, but if that's the case, then people shouldn't be experiencing anxiety and so on at 26, if that's going to be the main point of argument. I started paying bills and working at 15, 16, put myself through school. I bought my first car, 16, but my second car, my third car, all on my own. And I wish somebody at that time had looked at me and told me that I wasn't allowed to be making specific decisions for myself, because I think that's on a person-to-person basis. And I completely agree with you that if they're at that time, they're ready for that, then they're ready for it. And if they're not, they're not.
So now let's see the final decision from the undecided group. Now undecided, what's your final decision?
Oh, dramatic music. Oh, they take the chairs to the group. Oh my gosh. Wow.
So what's been great about this video is that a lot of you guys have switched different spectrums. So let's start out with what made you go to the liberal side.
I think that you made some really good points about being able to start puberty blockers and socially transition. And like surgeries do not need to happen before 18. They can happen after, but as long as the person can decide to start puberty blockers and decide to socially transition, because what if they don't make it to 25? So like I just don't, sorry. And like I've seen my cousin that I mentioned, I can't imagine my life without them, and if they were not, like if they're not able to transition, I know the effect that will have on their life, and I can't imagine it.
So the one person so far who's definitively, like, now on the liberal side instead of being undecided knows a trans person. I feel like that's quite an important point of, like, a lot of the time when you see people, I appreciate there is a trans woman on the conservative side. There are trans people that are pretty conservative in their views. Jubilee literally did a whole video on it. It's uncommon, but not impossible. But a majority of the time when you see people being incredibly transphobic and just completely not understanding or not being sure where their opinion falls on this situation, hearing this and then being like, okay, I'm more on the conservative, like, you know, somewhat, at least some people here, transphobic side, they don't know a trans person. They have not sat down and like spoken properly and listened with and gotten to know and had the trans experience and the trans community humanized to them. I feel like it's such an important thing where often trans people are like grouped and just seen as this like big scary community that are influencing kids and like big farmers making money off of them and all of this stuff. And it's like you're talking about individual people, and I think if you got to understand that, there would be a lot more compassion. There's just a total lack of compassion from a lot of people towards the trans community.
I think for me, what made me come to the conservative side is I definitely think that social transitioning is acceptable. I think of the case of like Angelina Jolie's daughter, who went through a long phase of, I guess, we were not entirely sure if it was gender dysphoria or not, but wanted to present as male, and then came to an age when they did decide that that was something they no longer wanted to do. And so I really respect that opinion, and I am also concerned about that. I really genuinely, we also, if we're not entirely sure like what the medical, you know, transitioning has long-term effects, or like the medicine itself on brain development and all that stuff, I think we should just be very wary of letting children transition.
That would lead to needing to be very wary about a lot of medical treatments that have nothing to do with being trans. And nobody had any issue with puberty blockers when it was just cis kids getting them.
Even if it is with medical, you know, teams, because as you said earlier, science is constantly a changing field.
I still lean very much towards the middle, but I think if I had to pick, I lean right now a little bit more on the conservative side. And I think the point you made about how we just don't know really like the detransition rate. Transitioning is a process, you know, medical transition, also social transition, and you're absolutely right, you know, in 10 years from now, you know, someone's experience might not be the exact same. I'm not saying that that's the case for everyone. I'm saying that that's probably still not even the majority of people, but I do think it's still a significant amount to take into consideration. There's still a lot that maybe we just don't fully understand, and I think until we get to that point, I'll just err on the side of caution, at least. That's how I see it.
But I'm wondering, like, who these people are to err on the side of caution. They're not trans. I appreciate there was a trans woman. I'd say that she has like the softest conservative view on this whole thing. Who are the other people to sit there and be like, I'm going to err on the side of caution. I think it's okay for socially transitioning to happen. You are not the medical professionals, you are not the researchers, and you are not the trans people. Where is the authority coming from?
Clearly, we all have our own biases, and hopefully we can consider all these different personal experiences as well as statistics, so thank you.
Woof. Wow, so that was it. That was a lot. That was long. I felt like I had a lot to say. There was one guy in particular on the conservative side who was very loud with his opinions, and I think the guy sitting next to him had like the same, or at least very similar opinions, but was just like a little bit quieter with them. My biggest thing is this is not something that should be up for a debate in the first place. Yes, people have different opinions on it. Yes, we can have conversations about it, but the whole setup of this felt really bizarre to like pit these two groups against each other, basically arguing for it was a lot more than just minors being able to transition, and there were also no parameters set or facts laid down that we saw, at least as a viewer, about what it meant for a minor to transition and what the minimum ages were and what the process actually involved. And I feel like unless that was spelled out, this wasn't a like accurate conversation. People didn't get all the information or all the accurate information. You also have a very, very loud conservative person person who has clearly either done some reading just for this or has gone down a rabbit hole previously and done some reading and is just like plucking names out and not giving the full story of certain situations and fear-mongering, basically. And it's like case studies of people who aren't actually there to speak for themselves, and none of them are of actual trans people. And I'm like, okay, so you seem to know of a couple of detransitioners and know of a parent who disagreed with their child transitioning. Okay, great, you're sharing a snapshot of some of their opinions, but I find the whole setup really weird to be like, hey, here are 3 people who aren't really sure, convince them, have a conversation to convince them to be on your side. Like, no, listen to trans people, read up about it. It's not something that should be up for debate. Trans people exist, and make up your own mind from that. I'm not here to convince anybody. I'm here to talk about what the trans experience is actually like and break down transphobia, break down the stigma, talk about the actual findings and results out there, and talk about my personal experience. I do find this setup very bizarre, and I do not know where they found that guy from. He was just like all kinds of phobic and saying some really, really like problematic things, and just had zero of that energy for anything else. It was all just like, trans people, trans minors shouldn't, trans people shouldn't. Yeah, but what about generally? What's your opinion on that? Interesting video. Let me know what you think down below. I need to go have a snack and maybe a nap. But yeah, thank you for watching this video and sticking with it to the end. If you're still here, think about giving a thumbs up and subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye.